Jack the Ripper was never just a killer. He was a story, a spectacle, a nightmare sold to the public in headlines, rumors, and fear. In the autumn of 1888, somewhere inside the choking fog of London's East End, a man began butchering women with such brutality that more than a century later, the world still remembers the name invented for him. Not his real name, not his face, not the truth, just the legend, Jack the Ripper. That name has survived because it feels almost supernatural. A phantom slipping through narrow alleys, a shadow with a knife, a monster in the gaslight. But the deeper you go into this case, the more disturbing the truth becomes. Because the real horror is not just that a killer walked through Whitechapel unseen, it is that he moved through a world that had already decided his victims did not matter. This is not only the story of a murderer who was never caught. It is the story of a broken city, a frenzy of media manipulation, suspicious letters, unreliable evidence, modern DNA, claims that may prove nothing, and 5 women whose real lives were buried beneath one of the most famous myths in criminal history. To understand the killer, you first have to understand the place that made him possible. Whitechapel in 1888 was not simply poor. It was collapsing under the weight of misery. The East End had become a crowded human trap, packed with laborers, immigrants, the unemployed, the sick, and the desperate. Entire families were crammed into filthy lodging houses. Disease moved easily. Hunger was constant. Alcohol offered a temporary escape. The streets were dark, cold, and chaotic. And in a district where survival itself was a daily battle, vulnerability was everywhere. For many women, there was no safety net. A lost marriage, a dead child, an illness, a drinking problem, a few missed payments, any of it could send a life spiraling downward into the street. Sleep itself became a luxury. 4 pence could buy a bed in a lodging house. Without it, you stayed outside, in the cold, in the dark, invisible. That matters because for generations, the victims of Jack the Ripper were flattened into a single crude label: prostitutes. It was a convenient label. It made the story simpler. It also made it easier for Victorian society and later the public to look away. But the truth is more tragic than that. These women were not symbols. They were not caricatures wandering the fog, waiting to be killed. They were wives, daughters, mothers, workers, women whose lives had been stripped apart by poverty, grief, addiction, abandonment, and a society that offered almost no path back once they fell. Mary Ann Nichols had once lived a more stable life before her marriage collapsed and hardship pushed her into the workhouse. Annie Chapman had known family life too, until personal tragedy and alcoholism destroyed what remained of it. Elizabeth Stride had worked in domestic service and tried to survive through odd jobs and reinvention. Catherine Eddowes was literate, sharp, and capable, a woman who wrote ballads and traveled with her partner. Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest and in some ways the most mysterious, remains the hardest to fully reconstruct. These were not just Ripper victims. They were human beings with histories. And once you understand that, the case changes. Because the killer may not have been targeting women for what they did. He may have been targeting them for how exposed they were. Homeless, exhausted, alone. In some cases, likely asleep or barely conscious when he found them. The first of the so-called canonical 5 was Mary Ann Nichols. In the early hours of August 31st, 1888, 2 men walking through Buck's Row noticed what looked like a dark bundle on the ground. At first, in the near-total darkness, they could not even understand what they were seeing. Only when a policeman arrived and light was brought closer did the truth emerge. Nichols' throat had been cut so deeply it reached the spine. Her abdomen had been mutilated. The murder was savage, but what chilled investigators was not only the violence, It was the suggestion of control. Whoever had done this had worked fast, in darkness, and then vanished. Just over a week later, on September 8th, the body of Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Again, the throat had been cut, but this time the mutilation was worse, far worse. Part of her body had been removed. The killer had escalated, and he had done it in a crowded neighborhood, frighteningly close to the waking city. Now panic was spreading. The police were already behind. This was the late 19th century. No fingerprint databases, no blood typing, no forensic preservation as we understand it now. Crime scenes were contaminated almost instantly. Crowds gathered. Witness statements conflicted. Newspaper hysteria overwhelmed fact. Detectives were not chasing a clean trail of evidence. They were drowning in rumor, fear, and public pressure. Then came the night that turned terror into legend. September 30th, 1888. The double event. First, Elizabeth Stride was found in Dutfield's yard. Her throat had been cut, but unlike the others, there was no major mutilation. Many investigators concluded the killer had been interrupted before he could continue. If that is true, then what happened next becomes even more horrifying. Less than an hour later, in Mitre Square, Catherine Eddowes was discovered. This time the killer had finished his work. Her throat was cut. Her body was mutilated. Organs had been removed. Her face had been slashed. It was a frenzy, but not a chaotic one. It suggested speed, experience, and a terrible purpose. And as the killer fled, he may have left behind the most infamous clue in the entire case. A blood-stained piece of Eddowes's apron was found in Goulston Street. Above it, written on a wall in chalk, was a message that has been argued over for more than a century. The wording varies depending on whose account you trust, but the meaning was explosive enough that Commissioner Charles Warren ordered it erased before daylight, fearing anti-Semitic violence in an already tense city. That decision still haunts the case. Was the writing left by the killer? Was it random graffiti? Was a vital clue destroyed or a dangerous distraction removed? No one knows. And that uncertainty sits at the heart of this entire mystery. Almost every famous detail in the Ripper case is surrounded by doubt. That includes the letters. As fear consumed London, the police and newspapers began receiving message after message from people claiming to be the murderer. Most were obvious hoaxes, but a few became immortal. The most famous began with 2 words, "Dear Boss." The writer mocked the police, boasted of the killings, and promised more violence. Most importantly, he signed it with the name the world would never forget, Jack the Ripper. Soon after came the Saucy Jackie postcard, appearing to reference the double event. Then came the most grotesque communication of all, the From Hell letter sent with half of a human kidney to George Lusk, head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. The writer claimed he had fried and eaten the other half. It sounds like the pure voice of a sadistic killer. But there is a major problem. Many experts now believe the most famous Ripper letters were probably hoaxes, and not just by random cranks. Some researchers have argued that journalists themselves may have written them to inflame the panic, sell papers, and keep the story alive. One later confession even suggested exactly that. If true, the implications are staggering. It would mean the name Jack the Ripper, the name that became one of the most infamous in criminal history, may not have come from the killer at all. It may have been a media creation, a brand, a piece of Victorian marketing built on real blood and real suffering. That possibility changes everything, because it means the story remembered by the world may have been manipulated from the beginning. And still, despite the mythology, the police did have suspects. Over the years, more than 100 names have been thrown into the ring. Some were plausible, some were absurd. Ordinary laborers, butchers, doctors, lunatics, foreigners, aristocrats, even members of the royal family have all been accused at one point or another. But in the modern era, two names rise above the rest. The first is Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish immigrant and Whitechapel resident who suffered from severe mental illness. Several senior officials later seemed to strongly imply that they believed he was the man. He was committed to an asylum and lived out the rest of his life there. Then, in the 21st century, came the claim that modern DNA had finally solved the case. A shawl, allegedly linked to the murder of Catherine Eddowes, was tested. Supporters of the theory claimed the DNA connected both Eddowes and Kosminski, and headlines around the world declared the mystery over. But that conclusion is nowhere near as solid as it sounds. The shawl's connection to the crime scene is deeply disputed. Its history is murky. It may never have been there at all. It has also been handled by many people over many years, making contamination a serious problem. And the DNA involved was mitochondrial DNA, which cannot uniquely identify one individual the way nuclear DNA can. At best, it can place someone within a broader maternal line shared by many others. In other words, it is not the final answer it was sold as. Then there is Walter Sickert, the painter. Crime writer Patricia Cornwell spent a fortune trying to prove he was the Ripper. Sickert's fascination with violence, his artwork, his correspondence, and DNA found on stamps have all been used to build a case against him. But again, the evidence weakens under pressure. The paper and materials were common. The DNA was not uniquely identifying, and if the letters themselves were hoaxes, then linking Sickert to them proves almost nothing about the murders. This is the pattern of the Ripper case over and over again. Every path seems promising at first. Then it dissolves into uncertainty. And perhaps nowhere is the true nature of the killer more visible than in the final canonical murder. Mary Jane Kelly was killed on November 9, 1888, inside her room at Miller's Court. Unlike the earlier murders, this one happened indoors, beyond the interruption of footsteps, patrols, passing carts, or dawn light. For the first time, the killer had privacy. What he did with that privacy was monstrous. Kelly's body was mutilated to a degree so extreme that even hardened investigators were horrified. Her throat had been cut to the spine. Her face was destroyed beyond recognition. Her body had been opened and dismembered with methodical cruelty. Organs were removed and placed around the room. Her heart was missing. This was not random frenzy. This was time, ritual, and control. In the previous murders, the killer had been constrained by the environment. Here, he was not. And what emerged was the clearest glimpse of the mind behind the blade. Not merely a man killing to kill, but someone enacting a fantasy of domination, mutilation, and possession. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. After Mary Jane Kelly, the canonical murders stopped. Why? That question has never been answered. Did the killer die? Was he imprisoned? Institutionalized? Did he leave London? Did he continue elsewhere under another name? Or have we built a neat sequence around 5 murders that were never as cleanly connected as we now assume? That uncertainty is the final twist of the knife. The Ripper case is not just unsolved because the evidence is old. It is unsolved because the story itself is unstable. The witnesses are unreliable. The letters are suspect. The clues are compromised. The suspects are controversial. The myth is so large that it distorts everything around it. And maybe that is why Jack the Ripper still endures. Not because we know who he was, but because we do not. Because he stands at the intersection of everything that terrifies us most: violence without explanation, identity without a face, fame built from horror, truth buried under media spectacle, and a world in which the vulnerable can be destroyed while everyone else argues over the legend. For more than a century, people have chased the man in the fog. But maybe the most disturbing truth is this: the fog helped create him. A society that ignored the poor, a press that sensationalized murder, investigators overwhelmed by primitive methods, a public hungry for a monster. Out of all of that came a figure larger than the crime itself, a phantom stitched together from blood, fear, rumor, and headlines. And while the killer disappeared into history, the women did not receive the same immortality. Their names were overshadowed by the name of the man who destroyed them. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. That is where this story should end, not with the legend, with them.